Daniel Mark stood in the heart of the abandoned server farm, a graveyard of obsolete technology stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lights. The air was thick with the smell of dust, old circuitry, and something else, ozone perhaps, or the ghost of electricity that once powered this cathedral of data. Rows upon rows of ancient servers loomed around him like tombstones, their chassis humming with a residual power that shouldn't exist, a low frequency that vibrated in his chest and made his teeth ache. The truth about the Anunnaki code, buried deep in Microsoft's foundational architecture, everything he'd sacrificed to uncover, was compressed into this small rectangle of metal and silicon. Daniel's cynicism, his years of distrust since the fall from grace as a software engineer, whispered the same bitter truth he'd learned long ago. When you dig too deep, someone buries you. The emergency lighting cast harsh red shadows that sliced across his face, painting him in the colors of warning and danger. He was trapped. Black tactical gear absorbed the dim light, making them seem less like men and more like negative space, absences carved from the world. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, who knew exactly how this encounter would end. Their weapons were drawn but lowered, not yet aimed, a professional courtesy or perhaps a psychological tactic. Let him see the inevitable before it happens. Daniel's back pressed against a wall of servers, the metal cold even through his jacket. The machines behind him hummed their death song, a frequency that seemed to resonate with his own accelerating heartbeat. Nowhere left to run. The phrase repeated in his mind like a corrupted loop of code, each iteration stripping away another layer of hope. Not a metaphorical edge, but a literal precipice between existence and erasure. The operatives had their orders. He could see it in the mechanical precision of their movements, in the way they didn't bother with threats or demands. Eliminate the target, recover the evidence, clean up the mess. He'd seen enough corporate machinations to know how this worked. People like him didn't just disappear. They were disappeared, carefully and completely. His mind raced through scenarios, each one ending in the same red-stained conclusion. Fight. With what? Angry words and a decade-old degree in software engineering? Run. The operatives had already cut off every exit, their formation a textbook example of tactical containment. Surrender, hand over the drive, and hope they'd let him live, despite knowing too much, despite being a loose end in an Anunnaki conspiracy that stretched back to the very foundations of the digital age. The cynicism that had protected him since his disgrace now paralyzed him. He'd stopped believing in rescue, in miracles, in anything that couldn't be quantified and verified. And yet, as the operatives closed the final meters between them, he found himself wishing, desperately, irrationally, for something beyond empirical evidence. But the shimmer grew more pronounced, rippling like water, disturbed by something rising from beneath. The temperature dropped. He could see his breath suddenly, short gasps of white in the red-lit darkness. Tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. Luminescent, as if lit from within by a light that existed outside the normal spectrum. The being's features flickered between human and something else entirely. Something that predated human categories, something that made his hindbrain scream in recognition or terror or both. Daniel could see it even in the dim red light, the tremor of fingers on triggers, the microscopic adjustments of aim, as if the target wouldn't stay still in their sights. Whatever this was, it wasn't in their briefing. The surface pulsed with symbols, and Daniel recognized them immediately. His breath caught. They were the same ancient symbols from the encrypted files on the drive, the Anunnaki code that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, according to every historical and technological timeline humanity accepted as truth. It resonated directly in his mind, bypassing the normal channels of sound and perception, settling into his consciousness like a thought that wasn't his own, but felt inevitable, as if it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Understanding everything meant understanding the conspiracy, the truth behind his disgrace, the reason the Anunnaki code was threaded through the architecture of modern computing. It meant answers to questions he'd been asking since the day they destroyed his career, since the day empirical evidence betrayed him and left him with nothing but cynicism and distrust. Never being the same person. He'd stopped being that person years ago, or something deeper, more permanent, a transformation that would place him beyond the reach of everything he'd known, everything he'd believed in, everything that made him Daniel Marks. Red targeting lasers cut through the dusty air, painting dots on Daniel's chest, his head, his hand clutching the hard drive. Professional execution patterns. They weren't taking chances anymore. Ancient civilizations didn't leave code in modern operating systems. This was a hallucination, a stress response, a trick by the operatives to make him surrender. His mind grasped for rational explanations even as the being stood before him, undeniably real in its impossible existence. Spend his last seconds clinging to a rationality that had never saved him, that had abandoned him when he needed it most. The symbols on its surface seemed to move, to reorganize themselves into patterns that tugged at something deep in his consciousness, something that remembered these shapes from before language, before logic, before the tyranny of empirical evidence. He looked at the being, luminescent and impossible, offering him everything he'd sacrificed for and demanding a price he couldn't calculate. Not because he suddenly believed, but because in this moment, suspended between extinction and transformation, between the certainty of death and the impossibility of salvation, belief seemed like the least important factor. What mattered was choice. What mattered was deciding whether the truth was worth becoming something he could never understand. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the world exploded into light and symbols and understanding that burned through every defense his rational mind had ever constructed. The operatives fired, but the bullets never reached him. The server farm disappeared, or he disappeared from it. The distinction became meaningless as reality folded around him like paper creasing along dimensions he'd never known existed. His last coherent thought, before transformation consumed him entirely, was a bitter laugh at his own expense. He'd spent years trusting only empirical evidence, and in the end, it was faith, desperate, irrational, impossible faith, that saved him. Daniel Marks sat hunched in the blue-white glow of 3 monitors, his spine curved into the permanent posture of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Lines of code scrolled across the screens. Someone else's problems, someone else's bugs. Anonymous work for anonymous clients who paid in cryptocurrency and never asked questions. Coffee cups formed rings of sediment, each marking a different all-night session. Some still had residue at the bottom, dark and thick as oil. Others had been there so long he couldn't remember drinking from them. The apartment was cramped, but Daniel didn't need space. Space was for people with lives, with futures, with reasons to move beyond the 3-foot radius between chair and keyboard. Outside the window, the Microsoft campus gleamed in the distance like a promised land from which he'd been exiled. The buildings caught the Seattle sunlight and threw it back in sharp geometric patterns, all glass and steel and crystallized ambition. From here, he could see the newer structures, the innovation centers, the architectural manifestations of a company that never stopped evolving. It was a constant reminder, that view. Some days he thought about closing the blinds permanently. Most days he just stared at it, letting the resentment build like plaque around his heart. The headline read, "Microsoft engineer claims cover-up in security protocols." His name was in the subheading. The article itself was marked up with red ink, his own handwriting from years ago, circling the parts where they'd gotten it wrong, where they'd misquoted him, where they'd subtly shifted the narrative from whistleblower exposing critical flaw to paranoid employee making unfounded accusations. The phrase felt like it belonged to someone else's biography, some alternate universe version of himself who'd made different choices. He'd been good, better than good. He'd understood code the way some people understood music, seeing patterns and structures that others missed. Management had noticed. His colleagues had respected him. He'd been on the trajectory toward senior architect, toward the kind of influence that shaped the future of technology, until he reported what he believed was a critical security flaw in legacy code. Encryption patterns that seemed to anticipate technological advances that hadn't existed when the code was written. It was elegant and wrong and utterly inexplicable. Not to his face at first. Corporate culture was too polite for direct confrontation, but he'd heard the whispers in the break room, seen the way conversations stopped when he entered. Paranoid, obsessive, unable to accept that sometimes code is just legacy cruft, accumulated technical debt that nobody wants to refactor because it works well enough. Performance reviews that suddenly found fault with work that had been praised months before. Quiet suggestions that maybe he needed time off, stress leave, psychological evaluation. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't the code. It was him. It was the kind of work that kept the lights on and the internet connected, the bare minimum maintenance of a life reduced to its essential functions. He was isolated by choice and circumstance, bitter in the way that only comes from being right and having no one believe you. Every coincidence was a pattern waiting to reveal its hostile intent. It was exhausting, maintaining that level of defensive paranoia, but it was also safe. If you never trusted, you could never be betrayed again. The strange mathematical structures, the impossible encryption, the sense that something old and inexplicable was woven into the fabric of modern computing. Daniel had been debugging a database integrity issue for a client in Estonia, or maybe Singapore. The routing made it impossible to tell. His eyes were burning from 8 straight hours of screen time. He was considering calling it a night when the notification appeared, overlaid on his active terminal. His third thought, the one that actually made him click, was curiosity. Very few people knew how to reach him through his secured channels. Whoever sent this had skills. Not a tremor, but a full-body response, adrenaline and anxiety and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. He read the message again, looking for the trap, the obvious signs of manipulation. The phrasing was simple, direct. Too simple, maybe. The kind of message designed to appeal to exactly his psychology, to exactly his obsession. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned server farm outside Redmond. He checked them against public records, cross-referenced with corporate property databases he probably shouldn't have access to. It was a decommissioned Microsoft facility from the 1990s, one of the original data centers from the company's expansion era, officially closed 15 years ago, unofficially forgotten, erased from current corporate maps. Standard practice. Check the routing, trace the origin, verify what could be verified before trusting anything. He initiated the decryption sequence for the header metadata, expecting the usual dead ends and proxy chains. The packet signatures used computational methods that predated modern internet architecture, or post-dated it, or existed outside it entirely. His decryption utility flagged 17 separate anomalies, each one suggesting that whoever sent this message had access to infrastructure that existed outside conventional technological timelines. Against every instinct telling him it's a trap, and every instinct was screaming trap, abort, delete and wipe the drive, Daniel found himself pulling on his jacket. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive and unincarcerated through years of digging where he wasn't supposed to dig, listed all the reasons this was suicide. Isolated location, anonymous message, no backup, no witnesses. Classic ambush setup. But beneath the cynicism and the defensive paranoia was the original impulse that had driven him into software engineering in the first place. The need to know, to understand, to solve the puzzle. That impulse had been buried under layers of bitterness and betrayal, but it wasn't dead, and this message had spoken directly to it. The roads outside Redmond were dark this time of year, stretches of highway punctuated by distant suburban lights. The GPS coordinates led him off the main route, down progressively smaller access roads until he was on a gravel path that his car's suspension definitely wasn't designed for. A massive concrete structure, windowless and institutional, surrounded by a fence that had rusted through in multiple places. No lights, no signs of security, no indication that anyone had visited this place in years. It was a graveyard of technology, a tomb for obsolete infrastructure. This was how they found bodies weeks later, if they found them at all. A few still hummed with residual power, LEDs blinking in random patterns like the neurons of a dying brain. No handrails, just concrete steps descending into the earth. The architecture was different down here, not the modern data center layout, but something more primitive, more experimental. Prototype server configurations, equipment that predated even the facility's official construction date. The terminal was ancient, hardware from the late 1980s, early 1990s at the latest. It should be in a museum, not running active processes. The screen showed a command prompt, waiting. He'd spent years studying the patterns of Microsoft's foundational code, knew the signatures better than he knew his own handwriting. These files matched perfectly, matched impossibly. Mathematical principles that shouldn't work, that violated established theorems, that somehow produced results more elegant and efficient than anything current computer science could achieve. Encryption algorithms based on number theory that wouldn't be discovered until years after these files were supposedly written. The files bore all the markers of authentic Microsoft source code, the coding conventions, the internal comments, the architectural decisions that matched documented company history. But the mathematical principles underlying them were impossibly advanced, as if someone had taken theoretical research from 50 years in the future and embedded it into code written in the 1980s. Daniel scrolled through page after page of impossible mathematics, his mind trying to construct explanations that wouldn't require abandoning everything he understood about the history of computing. Time travel. Corporate espionage with access to classified research, a hoax so sophisticated it required resources beyond any individual hacker. Or the explanation the evidence actually supported, that something non-human had contributed to the foundational architecture of modern computing, that the conspiracy he'd uncovered at Microsoft was deeper and stranger than corporate cover-up, that he'd been right in ways he couldn't have imagined. Years of isolation, bitterness, professional death, all of it justified if these files were real, if he could prove they were real, if anyone would believe him this time. Daniel stared at the screen, at the impossible code that glowed in the darkness of the sub-basement. He'd wanted proof. He'd found something that looked like proof. But proof of what, exactly? And what was he supposed to do with it? The download began. Megabytes of impossible code flowing into his drive, and somewhere in the darkness of the server farm above him, Daniel Marks crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The drive now felt like a bomb in his jacket pocket, warm and heavy with the weight of knowledge that could destroy him or save him, depending on who believed it. His legs felt disconnected from his body as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. His vision kept losing focus, objects blurring at the edges. He pulled drives from his emergency stash, the collection of encrypted storage devices he kept for exactly this kind of situation. External hard drives, USB sticks, even an old solid-state drive he'd salvaged from a previous build. He copied the files systematically, methodically, using different encryption algorithms for each backup. One he hid behind the loose baseboard in his bathroom. Another he sealed in a waterproof container and stuffed into the back of his freezer, behind bags of frozen vegetables he'd never eat. A third he prepared to mail to a P.O. box he maintained under a pseudonym in a different state. After tonight, after seeing that code, those mathematical impossibilities, he wasn't sure what he understood anymore. Not a sound or a smell, but an instinct, a primal recognition that his environment had been altered. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The apartment door was ajar, light from the hallway spilling through a 6-inch gap. He never left doors open. Never. It was part of his ritual, his security protocol, the defensive habits that had kept him safe in a world that wanted him silent. The apartment looked like a hurricane of malice had torn through it. Drawers pulled open, contents scattered across the floor. His filing cabinet, the one he kept locked, always locked, had been forced. The metal bent where someone had used a pry bar or crowbar. Papers were everywhere, his careful organization destroyed. His monitors were intact, but everything else, the hard drives, the backup arrays, the network equipment, had been dismantled with the efficiency of professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. Daniel's hands went immediately to his jacket pocket. The portable drive from the server farm was still there. He'd fallen asleep with it, and apparently they'd either missed it or hadn't wanted to wake him by searching his person. Small mercy. Terrifying implication. They'd been thorough, systematic, searching every hiding place a semi-paranoid software engineer might use. His secure backups, the ones he'd created over the years for general protection, were also gone. Storage devices pulled from their concealment spots with the precision of people who'd done this before. Terror, because this confirmed everything. The files were real, the conspiracy was real, the danger was real. Someone cared enough about those encrypted files to break into his apartment in broad daylight, to search with professional efficiency, to leave a message that was both warning and promise. The same rage he'd felt years ago when Microsoft destroyed his career, when they branded him paranoid and unstable, when they took everything he'd built and crushed it. The threat itself was validation, proof that he'd found something worth protecting, worth suppressing. Could still see the news articles that framed him not as a whistleblower, but as a disgruntled employee with paranoid delusions. It was staying off the street, keeping the internet connected, maintaining the minimal infrastructure of a life. The kind of person who shows up in conspiracy theory forums and YouTube comment sections, screaming about cover-ups to an audience of no one. It was the rational choice, the safe choice, the choice that his cynicism and experience recommended. The decision felt like defeat, tasted like acid and shame, but it also felt like sanity. Sometimes survival was victory enough. Sometimes living to fight another day was just living, period. Hammer, or microwave, or thermite from the emergency chemicals he kept for data destruction. He could eliminate the evidence, eliminate the threat, eliminate the choice. His apartment was bathed in soft blue light. Not the harsh blue of LEDs or monitors, but something organic, something that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The light didn't cast shadows. It simply existed, filling the space with a luminescence that made everything look both hyper-real and dreamlike. Impossibly tall, 7 feet, maybe 8, maybe more, depending on how it chose to orient itself in 3-dimensional space. Its form was luminescent, glowing from within like a creature made of foxfire or bioluminescence. The surface of its skin, if it was skin, shifted between solid and translucent, between opaque and see-through, as if it couldn't quite decide how material to be in this reality. Daniel recognized them from his research into the encrypted files, from the hours he'd spent cross-referencing the mathematical patterns against historical cryptographic systems, cuneiform characters, but alive, moving slowly across the being's form like messages written in light. But its voice resonated directly in Daniel's consciousness, bypassing ears entirely, settling into his mind like thoughts that weren't his own, but felt inevitable, as if they'd always been there waiting to be acknowledged. The natural consequence of too many sleepless nights, too much paranoia, too many years of isolation. His brain finally fracturing under the weight of conspiracy theories and professional trauma, creating an entity that confirmed his delusions. Just stood there, luminescent and impossible, watching him with eyes that were sometimes visible and sometimes not, depending on how solid it chose to be. It had presence, weight, an effect on the environment that couldn't be explained by neurological misfiring. The air pressure continued to shift in rhythm with its luminescence. The temperature had dropped several degrees. The symbols on its skin cast actual light that reflected off his walls. Mathematical structures that Daniel hadn't had time to fully analyze yet, hadn't shared with anyone, hadn't written down anywhere someone could find. The explanation is Anunnaki intervention in the development of computational theory. The third file in the architecture documents, the being continued, contains embedded coordinates. You saw them but didn't recognize their significance. They're astronomical coordinates for the Pleiades cluster, encoded in hexadecimal within what appears to be memory allocation functions. But if what the being said was true, if those coordinates were actually there, it would mean its features resolved into something almost human, 2 eyes, a mouth, recognizable proportions, before dissolving back into the luminescent ambiguity. He accepted. What if the code he'd found was exactly what it appeared to be, evidence of non-human intervention in human technological development? Help me expose the truth, and I'll restore what you lost. Your reputation, your credibility, your place in the world you were exiled from. Your place in the world you were exiled from. Microsoft campus glittering in the distance, the promised land he'd been cast out from, returned. It was a physical sensation, a chemical reaction in his brain. Endorphins and hope and hunger overriding the defensive mechanisms that had kept him safe and small and surviving. He could feel his cynicism cracking like ice under pressure, the armor that had protected him shattering in the face of an offer too perfect, too targeted, too precisely calibrated to his deepest wants. Everything in his experience suggested this was manipulation, exploitation of his psychological vulnerabilities by someone who'd done their research and knew exactly what buttons to push. Daniel looked at the being, luminescent and shifting in the blue light of his violated apartment, looked at the message still flashing on his monitor. Stop digging or disappear. Looked at the portable drive in his hand, containing evidence that someone wanted badly enough to threaten him for. I'll follow this wherever it leads. But redemption lies on the other side of transformation. The storage unit smelled of cardboard, dust, and the particular ozone scent of old electronics left running too long. Daniel had rented it under a false name, paid in cash, chosen a facility in Tacoma specifically because it was far enough from Redmond to avoid casual surveillance, but close enough to reach quickly. The space was cramped, barely 10 feet by 10 feet, filled wall-to-wall with computer equipment he'd salvaged, stolen or purchased from liquidation sales over the years. To Daniel it was a research laboratory, isolated from networks, air-gapped from surveillance, a place where he could work without leaving digital traces. The being was less translucent here than it had been in his apartment, as if it had settled more fully into material reality. The displays showed connections Daniel's rational mind had refused to see. On one side, the encrypted code from the server farm, broken down into its component algorithms. On the other, ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, photographed in museums and archaeological archives. The symbols matched, not metaphorically, not approximately, but exactly. The mathematical structures embedded in Microsoft's foundational code were identical to computational patterns recorded in clay 4,000 years ago. The cuneiform wasn't just language, it was the first programming language designed to prepare your species for the technology you would eventually create. Young engineers with security clearances working on systems that seemed impossibly advanced for their era. as if someone had seeded the research with knowledge from the future. The tablets had been catalogued, photographed, then buried in museum archives where nobody thought to look for them. It was simply watching, observing, collecting data with the patient thoroughness of a scientist conducting a very long experiment. Nobody had noticed because nobody had known to look, because the protocol was designed by intelligence far older and more sophisticated than human computer science. Not a simple counter. It was encrypted, distributed across millions of systems, each one holding a fragment that only made sense when assembled. Daniel used the processing power of the ancient computers around him, running decryption algorithms in parallel across hardware that shouldn't have been capable of the task. But counting down to what? The date was there, encoded in astronomical coordinates that referenced the position of stars rather than calendar systems. Daniel's hands trembled as he tried to convert the coordinates into a date he could understand. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics of something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. Daniel couldn't tell which. Footsteps in the corridor outside the storage unit, multiple sets, moving with the synchronized precision of trained operatives. The same cadence he'd heard at the server farm, the same professional coordination. But even as the question formed, he knew the answer. The surveillance protocol. If it monitored every network device, then it didn't matter how careful he'd been with his personal security. Any computer he'd touched, any network he'd accessed, any phone that had been near him, all of it fed data back to the protocol, back to whoever controlled it. They were cutting through the lock, not bothering with subtlety or legal niceties. This wasn't law enforcement. This was elimination of a problem. Not cutting through, but somehow convincing the molecules of the metal wall that they wanted to be somewhere else. The wall peeled back like paper, revealing a service tunnel beyond. Gunfire, sharp cracks that reverberated through the confined space, bullets sparking off metal walls. Keeper's luminescence dimmed, as if the being was channeling all its energy into speed rather than visibility. But adrenaline and terror pushed him forward, down the tunnel, up a maintenance ladder, out into the cold night air of an alley behind the storage facility. The surveillance protocol, they're using it to track us. They were up against something catastrophic, something that had been built into the foundation of modern civilization, something that was counting down to an event nobody understood. A private estate in the Pacific Northwest, hidden in forests so dense that satellite imagery showed only trees. The property belonged to a reclusive tech billionaire, someone whose name Daniel recognized but whose face hadn't appeared in public documentation since the mid-1980s. Then at the height of his influence, he'd simply vanished from public view, sold his company, bought this estate, and became a ghost haunting the edges of tech industry folklore. He chose a different path, to withdraw, to document, to preserve the evidence for future discovery. They entered through a basement access that keepers seemed to know about, descending into spaces that felt more like a bunker than a home. And in the center, under protective glass, documents that made Daniel's breath catch. Implementation timelines spanning decades, national security implications requiring absolute secrecy. Mathematical proofs that Gates shouldn't have known. Architectural decisions for software systems that anticipated hardware developments years before they occurred. Strategic business moves that seemed impossibly prescient, but which made perfect sense if someone was providing information about the future direction of technology. Computational power, the ability to build global information networks, to connect and communicate and process data at scales that would have taken centuries to develop naturally. In exchange, they asked only to observe, to monitor, to collect data on how humanity used and evolved the technology. But Daniel discovered something more terrifying as he dug deeper into the archive. The protocol wasn't passive. The surveillance wasn't just observation. Hidden in the documentation, referenced in cryptic passages in Aldrich's journals, was evidence of something else. The journals called it the activation event, described in language that suggested Aldrich himself hadn't fully understood what it meant, or as if something had altered the photographs after they were taken, removing, identifying details while leaving the evidence of presence. But it was also something beyond vindication. It was proof of something catastrophic waiting to happen. A test, Keeper said. My people have monitored Earth since Sumerian times, since we first made contact with your ancestors. We gave you tools, computational thinking, mathematical frameworks, the ability to build complex systems. We embedded those tools in your culture, in your myths, in your technology. The surveillance protocol is the final stage of observation. Whether humanity can be trusted with the power you've been given, whether you will use computational capability to transcend your limitations or to destroy yourselves. And when the countdown reached 0, when the astronomical coordinates aligned, when whatever trigger event the protocol was waiting for occurred, there would be a reckoning. At the journals and photographs and classified memos, at the proof of a conspiracy that stretched back 40 years, that had shaped the development of technology, that had made possible the connected world he'd lived his entire adult life within. Now he had evidence that could expose everything, that could prove the conspiracy, that could show the world the truth about the Anunnaki protocol and the test humanity was failing. Daniel Marks stood in the archive, surrounded by evidence, and realized that being right might be the worst thing that could happen. That vindication might cost not just his life, but the lives of everyone connected to the digital networks his people had built. Daniel obtained the ultimate proof on a Tuesday morning, pulling files from an archive that shouldn't exist, accessing documentation that had been classified beyond the normal spectrum of government secrecy. Keeper had guided him to a decommissioned DARPA facility outside Arlington, a building that looked abandoned but which still maintained power to a secure basement server room. The security was 30 years out of date. Legacy systems that Daniel bypassed with tools he'd written himself, exploiting vulnerabilities that modern engineers had forgotten existed. Daniel had to locate vintage playback equipment just to view it, connecting ancient hardware to modern displays through adapter chains that shouldn't work, but somehow did. The timestamp on the footage read November 7th, 1975. The location tag identified it as Conference Room 3 Alpha, a designation that no longer appeared in any DARPA facility maps. Young Bill Gates entered the frame. He looked impossibly young, barely out of his teens, wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as a college student rather than a businessman. His movements were nervous, uncertain, the body language of someone who didn't quite know why he'd been summoned or what he was walking into. Not the luminescent, shifting forms that Keeper presented. These beings looked almost human, bipedal, clothed in what appeared to be ordinary business attire from the 1970s, but their movements were too fluid, too precise. They walked without the normal micro-adjustments that human balance required, without the unconscious imperfections that marked all biological motion. It was as if someone had programmed robots to imitate humans, but had optimized the movement algorithms beyond what actual human physiology could achieve. Even in the degraded video quality, Daniel could see they were covered in dense text, diagrams, mathematical notations. The beings remained in the conference room, and then Daniel rewound and watched again to be certain. They simply weren't there anymore. Not leaving through the door, not moving out of frame, just present in one frame and absent in the next, as if they'd been deleted from reality. He zoomed in on moments when Gates shifted the briefcase, when papers were visible through the opening. The code was partially legible, enough for Daniel to recognize structures and patterns. Network protocols that anticipated the architecture of the Internet years before ARPANET had proven the concept was viable. Evidence that Bill Gates hadn't just been a genius entrepreneur, but had been given knowledge, prepared, chosen to accelerate computing toward a specific end. Automated distribution to tech watchdog groups, conspiracy researchers, anyone who might amplify the signal before it could be suppressed. Knew how to encrypt data so thoroughly that even state-level actors would need months to crack it. Knew how to time simultaneous releases so that no single point of failure could stop the information from reaching the public. Would prove that his original whistleblowing at Microsoft hadn't been paranoia, but had been him stumbling onto something vastly larger than corporate corruption. Would show the world that he'd been right all along, that the patterns he'd seen had been real, that the cynicism and distrust that had armored him had been justified. Keeper's voice resonated in his skull with urgency that bordered on panic. The system is designed to activate if humans discover its existence. That is part of the test, whether your species can develop technologically without detecting the surveillance embedded in your systems. Discovery equals failure. Activation means those fragments execute simultaneously. A cascade failure propagating through every computer, every server, every device connected to the internet. Financial systems, power grids, medical infrastructure, transportation networks, communication satellites, everything dependent on digital technology fails simultaneously. Immediate deaths from infrastructure failure, transportation accidents, medical system collapse, loss of emergency services, between 50 and 100 million. Secondary deaths from economic collapse, supply chain breakdown, civil disorder. The models become uncertain, but projections range into the billions over the following months. His proof that he'd been right all along. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Daniel demanded, his voice rising towards something that might become shouting or might become sobbing. "Why let me prepare all this, build all these distribution channels, get to the point of release if exposure would kill billions? Needed to see that truth and justice are not always aligned with survival. You've been not telling me everything from the beginning. Right now, or I release everything. You want billions of people to die. Better to reset your civilization now, while you're still confined to one planet, than to allow you to become a threat to the galaxy. If humans discover the surveillance, we have grounds to activate the protocol and reset your species to a pre-technological state. You've been my mechanism for triggering that discovery. A paranoid, discredited whistleblower who would dig deeper than anyone else, who would find the evidence, who would be driven by personal psychology to expose it publicly. Everything you promised, redemption, vindication, restoration, it was all manipulation. It was stealing the evidence, copying files with methods that bypassed every security protocol Daniel had implemented, extracting data directly from hardware through means that looked less like hacking and more like reality manipulation. You'll be blamed for the collapse, the paranoid conspiracy theorist who doomed humanity. My faction will have its justification. Your species will be reset. Everything proceeds as designed. But Keeper's presence seemed to fill the space, appendages everywhere, operating multiple systems simultaneously with computational speed that no biological entity should possess. They'd found him. Probably had been tracking him for days, waiting for the right moment to close in, letting him do the investigation work before seizing the evidence. He was trapped between two forces, each willing to sacrifice him for their agenda. Keeper's faction wanted to trigger the protocol, to reset humanity before it could become an interstellar threat. The government wanted to suppress the evidence, to maintain the status quo, to keep the conspiracy hidden, even if it meant leaving the countdown running toward whatever catastrophe it was designed for. Keeper continued copying data, its form now fully revealed, no longer the friendly luminescent being, but something darker, something that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, something that made Daniel's eyes hurt to look at directly. Either way you lose, either way billions die. The only variable is timing. Daniel's hands shook as he stared at his systems, at the evidence of the greatest conspiracy in human history being stolen by an alien entity that had manipulated him from the beginning, surrounded by government forces that would disappear both him and the truth if given the chance. Where the truth was a weapon that would destroy everything he'd tried to save. Daniel Marks, paranoid whistleblower, discredited software engineer, pawn in an extraterrestrial civil war, stood in a decommissioned DARPA facility and realized that some truths were too dangerous to expose and too important to suppress. Daniel's safe house, a rented room in Tacoma under a false identity, chosen specifically because it was anonymous and forgettable, became a war zone in the space between heartbeats. The door exploded inward, hinges torn from the frame by breaching charges. Tactical teams flooded through the opening, moving with the practiced efficiency of operators who'd done this hundreds of times. But his legs weren't working properly, his equilibrium destroyed by the flashbang's concussive force. He managed 3 steps before they were on him. Hands gripped his arms with professional brutality, twisting them behind his back. The zip tie bit into his wrists, plastic cutting skin, tightened to the point of nerve damage. "Daniel Marks, you're being detained under national security protocols," a voice said close to his ear, perfectly calm despite the violence of the entry. "Do not resist. Do not speak. Compliance is your only option." They were moving before Daniel's vision cleared enough to see the interior. Windowless cargo space, 2 operatives in tactical gear watching him with weapons ready, emergency lighting casting everything in harsh red shadows. Daniel tried to track the turns, to maintain spatial awareness, but after 15 minutes he'd lost all sense of where they were or which direction they were heading. This was a black site, the kind of facility that didn't appear on any government documentation, where people could be held and questioned without judicial oversight or constitutional protection. Into an interrogation room that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd studied every psychological torture manual ever written. Harsh fluorescent lighting, metal chair bolted to the floor, mirror that was obviously one-way glass, temperature deliberately kept cold enough to be uncomfortable. Then they left him alone. 2 agents entered, both wearing the kind of anonymous business attire that marked federal operators. One carried a thick folder, the other wheeled in a cart with a laptop and external monitor. "We need to discuss what you've uncovered, and more importantly, what you're about to cause. You qualify. We've known about it since 1979, 4 years after initial contact with Gates. It took that long for our signals intelligence to detect the embedded code, to understand what had been woven into the foundation of digital technology. Analysis of its capabilities, threat assessments, written in the dry, clinical language of government analysts describing the end of civilization. Financial networks, everything dependent on silicon and software, fails simultaneously. Civilization collapses within weeks, Reeves said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been living with this knowledge for years. We've modeled every scenario. Best case, 30% of global population survives the first year. Worst case, extinction-level event as nuclear facilities fail, as climate control systems go offline, as every technological dependency becomes a lethal vulnerability. He'd known the protocol was dangerous, but seeing it laid out in classified analysis, in satellite imagery and population modeling, made it real in a way that abstract knowledge hadn't. The conspiracy you uncovered isn't just corporate, it's international, involving every major government that understood what was at stake. We couldn't detect it, couldn't interfere with its influence. You stopped being a manageable problem and became an active threat. Your investigation has brought the world to the brink of apocalypse. It's using the distribution channels you built, releasing evidence publicly through encrypted networks. Once enough people see the proof, once the protocol detects widespread human awareness of its existence, it triggers automatically. We estimate 36 hours until activation threshold is reached. His desperate quest for personal redemption had doomed billions of people. Every choice he'd made, every investigation he'd pursued, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all of it had been driving toward this moment. toward the apocalypse he'd been manipulated into causing. His cynicism had armored him against trust and betrayal, but it hadn't protected him against being used, against being the weapon that would destroy everything. Years of disgrace and isolation had been building toward redemption, toward proving he'd been right, and he'd gotten exactly that. He'd been right about the conspiracy, right about the embedded code, right about everything his paranoid instincts had warned him about. Food appeared at irregular intervals, not starvation, but not comfort either, just enough to keep him functional. "We're out of options," Reeves said, his voice carrying exhaustion and desperation. "Every attempt to stop the upload has failed. The alien is using protocols we can't counter, routing through networks that exist outside our infrastructure. We're watching the evidence spread in real time, watching the awareness threshold approaching, and we can't stop it." This contains the full archive of the Anunnaki Protocol's code, everything we've collected over decades of analysis, every layer, every subroutine, every algorithm we've been able to reverse engineer. Some way to stop the activation sequence or disable the protocol before it triggers. You're the best code analyst we've identified, better than our people, better than anyone else who's studied this. If there's a solution hidden in that code, you're our best chance of finding it. A desperate gamble by people who had no other plays left. It was code designed by intelligence far beyond human capability, optimized over what might have been centuries or millennia. Daniel worked through exhaustion and despair. His brilliant mind, the same mind that had once identified vulnerabilities in Microsoft's architecture, that had seen patterns others missed, that had gotten him both promoted and destroyed, focusing with desperate intensity. Code that looked like error handling, but whose structure was subtly wrong. Not wrong like a bug, but wrong like intentional camouflage. Like something designed to be overlooked by anyone who saw it. The Anunnaki had built it as an emergency measure, a way to shut down the entire system if something went catastrophically wrong. But they'd hidden it in plain sight, disguised as error-handling code that every programmer would recognize but never question. The kind of code that looked boring, that looked like standard exception handling, that nobody would examine closely because it appeared to serve an obvious maintenance function. Daniel traced the kill switch's logic, understanding slowly how it worked. It required specific inputs in a precise sequence, like a combination lock embedded in algorithmic form. The inputs had to come from within the protocol's own infrastructure. It couldn't be triggered externally, couldn't be activated by anyone who wasn't already deep inside the system's operational core. Or they would have destroyed it. They'd been using the protocol as a weapon to reset humanity, but they'd been operating from incomplete understanding. They knew how to trigger the catastrophic activation, but didn't know about the emergency shutdown. "I found something," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from hours of not speaking. "A kill switch, hidden in the protocol's deepest layers. I can deactivate the entire system permanently. That's where the alien is completing the upload, where the protocol has its deepest access to foundational infrastructure. I need to be there, physically connected to those systems, with administrative access. I have to be inside the system, inside the server farm's network, to execute the sequence. Weapons, if you want them, though against an entity like that they're probably useless. But understand, if you fail, if this is a mistake, or if you're compromised by the alien's influence, we have standing orders to sterilize the entire facility. Fuel air bomb that will leave nothing but a crater. You, the alien, the servers, everything. It's our final failsafe." His mind was clear for the first time since the capture, focused on the problem with the intensity that had once made him a brilliant engineer. Not redemption anymore, not vindication. Just the problem that needed solving, the code that needed debugging, the catastrophe that needed preventing. "After everything we did to you, discrediting you, destroying your career, imprisoning you, why help us now? Because being right doesn't matter if everyone's dead," Daniel said simply. Because maybe redemption isn't about vindicating yourself. It's about fixing the harm you've caused. Because someone has to debug this catastrophe, and apparently I'm the only one who can. Daniel Marks, discredited whistleblower, manipulated pawn, brilliant analyst, drove toward the abandoned server farm where his quest had begun and where it would end, in salvation or annihilation, in redemption or final failure. The narrative had looped back to its beginning, but everything had changed. He wasn't here by accident or desperation. He'd been released specifically to confront the alien and deactivate the protocol. The government operatives closing in from all sides weren't there to kill him. They were a containment perimeter to prevent Keeper from escaping, to ensure that whatever happened in this facility stayed within its walls. The emergency lighting cast harsh red shadows across Daniel's face as he clutched the portable hard drive containing encrypted files. But now he understood those files were obsolete, redundant. The real weapon wasn't the evidence on the drive. It was the knowledge in his mind, the kill switch sequence he'd deciphered in his cell, the understanding of how to unravel the Anunnaki protocol from within its own architecture. Keeper stood before him, luminescent and shifting, its form flickering between the benevolent guide it had pretended to be and the darker truth beneath. The alien held the crystalline device, its surface pulsing with ancient symbols and something new, a progress indicator showing digital uploads spreading across networks. Minutes remained before the evidence went public and triggered the global collapse. Minutes before awareness reached the threshold that would activate the protocol's catastrophic shutdown. Trust me, and you'll understand everything, but you can never go back. Together we can guide the protocol's activation to minimize suffering, to preserve what's worth preserving. And you'll be responsible, the paranoid whistleblower who doomed humanity because he couldn't accept help when it was offered. Hours of analyzing the protocol's code in his cell had given him understanding that Keeper didn't know he possessed. The crystalline device wasn't an escape, it was a trap. Merging consciousness with the network would trap him just as thoroughly as it was about to trap Keeper, would make him part of the protocol, subject to its logic, unable to execute the kill switch sequence that required external intentionality. A false binary designed to prevent him from seeing the third option that actually existed. I'm not joining you. I'm not accepting your binary of transcendence or apocalypse. Not the portable systems, not the modern hardware, but the original infrastructure that had been running in this facility since the 1990s. The terminal that was still connected to the deepest layers of the protocol's architecture still had administrative access to systems that predated the internet as the public knew it. The kill switch sequence was complex, required inputs in precise order, each one unlocking access to deeper layers of the protocol's core. The being's appendages extended, no longer tentative or peaceful, but sharp and fast, reaching for Daniel with crystalline fingers that looked like they could cut through steel. Without it, humanity will expand unchecked, will export violence and exploitation to worlds that can't defend themselves. Its physical form became fully solid for the first time, choosing material presence over quantum uncertainty, sacrificing its safety for the chance to stop Daniel. Crystalline fingers reached for the keyboard, for Daniel's hands, for anything that could interrupt the sequence. Bullets tore through the space where Keeper had been, but the being moved with inhuman speed, dodging between projectiles, its form becoming translucent, just long enough for rounds to pass through harmlessly. It was fighting for its life now, for its mission, for the reset of humanity it had spent so long engineering. Pain lanced through him. Not physical damage, but something deeper. His vision blurred, his consciousness wavered. Keeper was trying to force the merge, to trap his mind in the network whether he agreed or not. Not the harsh red of emergency systems, but something brighter, whiter, spreading like fire through ancient hardware. The Anunnaki protocol began its shutdown sequence, unraveling decades of embedded code across global networks. Fragments of the surveillance system deactivated in cascading waves, each one triggering the next, recursive destruction spreading through every network device on Earth. The sound was beyond human comprehension. Not audio, but something that existed in dimensions hearing wasn't designed to perceive. A frequency that made Daniel's teeth crack, that made blood vessels burst in his eyes, that conveyed terror and rage and realization. As that infrastructure collapsed, Keeper's anchor to material existence collapsed with it. Even if it means we export violence and exploitation to the stars. Even if we become the threat you fear, because at least then it's our choice, our responsibility, our mistakes to make and learn from. Without observation, without guidance, your species will destroy itself or become something monstrous. We were your safeguard, your final chance to be something better than your nature. It unraveled the surveillance code, but at the cost of destroying the systems that hosted it. Servers exploded in cascading failures, sparks and smoke filling the air. The concrete structure groaned as support systems failed, as decades of accumulated stress found release. Daniel ran. Through corridors filling with smoke, past server racks tearing themselves apart, toward emergency exits that were designed for a building that wasn't actively trying to kill everyone inside it. His lungs burned from smoke inhalation. His vision blurred from the damage Keeper had done to his eyes, but his legs kept moving, carrying him through the chaos toward anything that looked like outside. Behind him, deeper in the facility, something exploded with force that suggested mainframe batteries failing catastrophically. The shockwave threw Daniel forward, out through a collapsing doorframe, into cold night air that felt like salvation. When he finally stopped and turned, the server farm was engulfed in flames, entire sections of the structure collapsing inward, consuming Keeper's physical form and any evidence of what had happened within those walls. Consciousness intact, not trapped in a dying network. The location was deliberate, chosen specifically because it gave him a view of the gleaming buildings where his career had once been destroyed. But the view didn't carry the same weight of resentment anymore. Didn't feel like exile looking at a promised land. Just felt like buildings, architecture, a company that had shaped technology without knowing about the alien influence woven into its foundations. Brief reports of a mysterious industrial accident at an abandoned facility outside Redmond. An old Microsoft data center that had suffered catastrophic equipment failure, leading to structural collapse and fire. Investigation ongoing, but early findings suggested decades of deferred maintenance and unsafe conditions. No casualties reported. The building had been unoccupied for years. The story had been quickly buried in the news cycle, displaced by more immediate concerns, more entertaining scandals. Within a week, it had disappeared entirely from public consciousness, exactly as designed. The message contained documents, a new identity, complete with background and documentation that would survive any scrutiny short of classified databases. A generous settlement described as compensation for consultation services rendered to undisclosed government agencies, financial security for the rest of his life, subtle corrections to the narrative that had branded him paranoid and delusional, anonymous recommendations from respected figures that opened doors previously closed. His career quietly restored through channels that left no obvious fingerprints. Daniel accepted the terms. He'd learned that redemption wasn't about public recognition or proving others wrong, wasn't about vindication or being right or having his name cleared in the public record. It was about personal integrity and making the right choice when everything was on the line, about fixing the harm you caused, about debugging catastrophes, about choosing to save billions of strangers rather than satisfy personal need for acknowledgement. He looked out the coffee shop window at the night sky, knowing humanity had been given a second chance to determine its own future. The Anunnaki code was gone from Earth's networks. He'd verified it personally, checking systems across multiple infrastructure categories, finding only inactive fragments and confused remnants where the protocol had been. Computational principles that were slightly more advanced than they should be for their era of development. Mathematical structures in legacy code that suggested external influence. Reminders that humanity had never been alone in the universe. That observation from older civilizations was real, that the galaxy was populated and watching. The coffee shop was mostly empty this time of night, just a few late workers and students occupying tables. He stood, gathered his things, no longer looking over his shoulder for operatives or threats. The paranoia that had armored him for years had become something different, not gone, but tempered by understanding that sometimes trust was necessary, that sometimes cooperation with authorities he'd distrusted led to outcomes that pure cynicism couldn't achieve. As his laptop screen went dark in the final seconds before shutdown, Daniel noticed something that made him freeze. Keeper had represented one perspective among the Anunnaki, one approach to the problem of emerging technological civilizations. But there were others out there, watching, waiting, observing what humanity did with its second chance. Not with fear or cynicism, but with something that felt like acceptance. He was no longer afraid of the unknown, no longer paralyzed by conspiracies he couldn't fully understand. He'd faced the deepest conspiracy imaginable and had made the choice to let humanity fail or succeed on its own terms. Not guided by ancient protocols, not reset by civilizations that viewed them as threats, not saved or destroyed by forces beyond their understanding. His phone showed messages from the new identity's email, job offers, networking opportunities, the infrastructure of a life rebuilt from careful manipulation by government handlers who needed him functional and quiet. That being right was less important than doing right. That personal vindication was a small thing compared to preserving humanity's chance to determine its own fate. Daniel Marks, former whistleblower, former pawn, former prisoner, walked through Seattle streets that felt simultaneously familiar and new. He'd been given a second chance. Humanity had been given a second chance. 6 months later, Daniel stood backstage at the Washington State Convention Center in Seattle, listening to his introduction through speakers that made the words sound simultaneously grandiose and hollow. His government handlers had arranged this speaking engagement as part of the rehabilitation of his professional identity. Daniel Marks, security consultant, expert in legacy code architecture, keynote speaker at TechSec Northwest, one of the premier technology conferences on the West Coast. Now he was being introduced as a thought leader in computational security, someone whose insights into foundational code vulnerabilities had made him invaluable to companies trying to secure systems built on decades-old architecture. The lights were bright enough that he couldn't see individual faces beyond the first few rows, which was probably deliberate. Easier to speak to an abstract audience than to see the specific humans judging every word. Daniel discussed real vulnerabilities, real solutions, drawing on his years of experience debugging systems that predated modern security practices. Just talked about buffer overflows and integer errors and the kind of mundane security flaws that had been lurking in legacy code since the dawn of computing. No one looked at him with the mixture of pity and contempt he'd grown accustomed to during his years of disgrace. He continued his presentation, discussing mitigation strategies for legacy vulnerabilities, techniques for securing systems without complete architectural rewrites. His eyes scanned the audience during natural pauses, trying to identify the source of the sensation. A figure sat perfectly still while everyone around them shifted in their seats, adjusted positions, fidgeted with the micro-movements that characterized human bodies existing in time. The figure's stillness was absolute, inhuman in its precision. He finished his main points, opened the floor to final questions, fielded inquiries about specific code libraries and encryption methodologies. Standard conference material, the kind of professional exchange that happened at thousands of similar events. Not the normal retro reflection of human eyes, but something more pronounced, more metallic, as if the eyes were designed to gather information rather than merely perceive it. He left the stage through the side exit, feeling the watching continue even as he moved out of direct line of sight. The figure in the third row had been something other. Not hostile necessarily, but not human either. Observation of a kind that went beyond professional interest or casual attention. Most attendees remained seated, but some had shifted positions during the transition. Except for the business card placed precisely in the center of the seat. Not from academic study, but from weeks of analyzing the Anunnaki protocol, from hours staring at holographic displays that Keeper had projected, from intimate familiarity with the mathematical language that predated human civilization. His expression remained calm, neutral, the face of a professional who just delivered a successful keynote and was now casually reviewing the venue. Anyone watching would see nothing noteworthy, no indication that he'd just received communication from entities that had been observing Earth since Sumerian times. The protocol was gone, Keeper's faction had been thwarted, but that had never been the end of the story. Just the conclusion of one chapter in something vastly longer. But that was one test among many, one checkpoint on a timeline that stretched backward thousands of years and forward into futures Daniel couldn't predict. Would they develop wisdom, commensurate with their technology, becoming the kind of species that older civilizations could welcome? Or would they find some third path, something the Anunnaki hadn't anticipated, something that would surprise observers who'd been monitoring emerging civilizations for millennia? Not a hero or a savior, just someone who'd been in the right place with the right skills when a choice needed making. Someone who'd debugged a catastrophe because that was what he knew how to do. Earth existed under observation from civilizations that viewed human technological development the way scientists viewed bacteria cultures, with interest, with caution, with readiness to intervene if the culture demonstrated dangerous characteristics. But terror and paranoia were exhausting, and Daniel had learned that acceptance was more sustainable than constant vigilance. As Daniel left the conference hall, he didn't look back at the empty seat or scan the crowd for other figures, with eyes that reflected light wrong. Didn't check over his shoulder for surveillance or threats. Didn't let the knowledge of observation control his actions. Because he'd learned something fundamental in the server farm, in the moment when he'd chosen to activate the kill switch rather than accept Keeper's impossible choice. The future isn't written by those who observe. It's created by those who act. Only humans could do that, through billions of individual choices, through collective decisions about technology and expansion and the kind of species they wanted to become. He'd make more presentations, would consult on security projects, would rebuild credibility in an industry that had once destroyed him. The business card in Daniel's pocket felt warm, almost alive, its metallic surface conducting heat from his body in ways normal materials didn't. A reminder that observation was real, that Earth existed in a cosmos populated with intelligence, that the choices humanity made rippled beyond the boundaries of a single planet. Daniel smiled slightly, an expression that was neither fearful nor cynical, but something closer to acceptance. He knew the future wasn't written, knew that other eyes continued watching, knew that tests would come, challenges would emerge, decisions would matter in ways that rippled across galactic timescales. And he knew that when those moments came, humanity would face them the same way he'd faced the impossible choice in the server farm, by making the best decision possible with incomplete information, by choosing action over paralysis, by creating the future rather than waiting for others to determine it. And Daniel Marks, former whistleblower, former pawn, former prisoner, current keynote speaker and security consultant, walked through the Seattle evening, knowing that being observed was less important than how you chose to act while being watched. Somewhere among those stars, civilizations observed Earth with instruments and methods beyond human detection, waiting, testing, observing whether this particular emerging species would become threat or peer or cautionary tale. Because in the end, that was the only redemption that mattered. Not being right, not being vindicated, not being observed and judged favorably by powers beyond human understanding.